All right, let's dive in. We're tackling something might sound a little offbeat today.
Yeah.
Unintentional sins.
Unintentional sins.
Yep. We're going to be using Leviticus.
Yeah.
Specifically chapters 5.1 and 19.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Now I know what you're thinking. How do you sin unintentionally, right?
Yeah, that does seem a bit paradoxical.
Stick with us, though, because this deep dive will reveal how this ancient concept is surprisingly relevant even today. We're going to unpack a system of offerings, get this, tailored to different transgressions and a person's economic status.
Wow, ancient social justice.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. The concept of unintentional sin wasn't just about actions, it was a whole way of thinking. The ancient Israelites believed even minor actions could disrupt a spiritual balance.
So, like, things we might do without thinking twice.
Exactly.
Okay, I need an example. What kind of things were considered unintentional sins in Leviticus?
Well, one example is failing to testify when you have important knowledge.
Interesting.
Another is accidentally touching something considered ritually unclean.
Oh, I see.
And get this, making a rash oath without really thinking it through.
So if I, let's say, shared a news story online without checking if it's true and it turned out to be fake,
You got it.
that could be like an unintentional sin.
You could definitely draw a parallel there. And the text emphasizes that even these actions, even what we might see as minor slip-ups, have consequences. It wasn't about the intention behind the action, but the impact.
Okay, so it wasn't about punishing bad intentions. Then what was the purpose of atonement?
That's a great question. Atonement in this context wasn't just about punishment or appeasing a higher power, but taking responsibility and acknowledging the harm caused and taking steps to make things right.
And that's where the offerings described in Leviticus come in. Right?
Yes, exactly. And they offer a fascinating window into how they approach this whole idea of making things right.
Okay, walk us through it. What were people expected to offer?
Okay, so Leviticus outlines a variety of scenarios and corresponding offerings. In some cases, a female sheep or goat was required.
A whole sheep or goat?
Yes. But for those who couldn't afford that, 2 turtle doves or even a small amount of flour were considered acceptable.
Hold on. So they had different levels of offerings based on someone's financial situation.
Yes, that's what I find particularly fascinating.
Wow. It suggests a deep concern for social equity and inclusivity, that everyone should have a chance to seek atonement regardless of their wealth.
Precisely.
It's like a sliding scale for atonement.
You could say that. It could be about accessibility for sure, but maybe it also reflects a deeper understanding, an acknowledgement that sometimes our circumstances might limit our ability to make amends in certain ways.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how this concept might translate to modern-day ideas of justice and accountability.
It really does. It challenges us to think about how our current systems might unintentionally exclude certain groups. Yeah. And how we can create more equitable paths towards making things right.
Okay, back to the offerings for a second. I have to admit, some of the rituals described are pretty, well, intense. Like there's this one passage that talks about pinching a bird's head, but not severing it completely.
Oh.
Pretty graphic. What do you make of those details?
Those details can definitely seem strange to us today. But for the ancient Israelites, they were likely full of symbolic meaning. Remember, they communicated a lot through ritual and symbolism.
So what might the pinching of the bird's head or the sprinkling of blood on the altar symbolize?
That's where we get into interpretation, and there's no one right answer.
Yeah.
But let's consider some possibilities. The pinching, for example, could represent the restraint required in seeking atonement. It's not about inflicting unnecessary harm, but about acknowledging the severity of the transgression. And the blood, well, that's a powerful symbol in many cultures. It could represent the sacrifice involved in making amends.
It's almost like they were physically enacting the process of atonement through these gestures.
Exactly. These rituals weren't just empty actions. They were a way for people to engage with the process of making amends on a visceral, emotional level, a tangible framework for processing guilt, seeking forgiveness, and restoring balance.
Wow. It's incredible how these ancient practices can offer such rich insights into the human condition.
Isn't it? And what we've uncovered so far is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore within these texts.
You've definitely piqued my curiosity. We've covered so much already. The idea of unintentional sins, the system of offerings, and the symbolism in their rituals.
And we're just getting started.
Oh.
We still need to unpack the concept of trespassing against holy things.
Ooh, okay.
Which raises some interesting questions about what we consider sacred in our modern world.
Now I'm really intrigued. I can't wait to dive into that.
Me too.
Those rituals we were talking about before the break, with the offerings and all, they're pretty hard-hitting, even reading about them today.
Yeah, I agree. Those details can feel very distant from our experiences now. But there's a lot more to those rituals than what we see on the surface. They offer a glimpse into how the ancient Israelites dealt with some pretty complex ideas about taking responsibility and making things right.
So you're saying there's more to those rituals than meets the eye?
Oh, absolutely. Remember, for them, actions spoke volumes. It wasn't just going through the motions, but about engaging with atonement on a deeper level.
Okay, I'm following you. But how did those rituals help people actually make things right? Help me connect the dots.
Let's put it this way. Imagine you've done something wrong, even if you didn't mean to, and you carry that weight around. Participating in these rituals with their symbolic actions and offerings gave people a tangible way to process that guilt and start to repair the harm.
There's like a physical way to show their inner atonement.
Exactly. It reminds us that atonement isn't just a concept, it requires action, a real effort to make things right, and sometimes even a symbolic sacrifice.
And that brings us back to that point about the offerings being tied to a person's financial status. What's the lesson there?
Well, it shows a deep understanding of social realities, don't you think? Imagine a system where only the wealthy could afford to make amends for their transgressions. That wouldn't be justice.
Yeah, it'd be a two-tiered system. Justice only for the rich.
Precisely. The system in Leviticus pushes back against that idea. It recognizes that everyone, no matter how much money they have, should have the chance to seek forgiveness and make things right.
Makes you wonder if we could learn something from that approach today.
It really does. Think about our justice systems today. Do they always provide fair access to making things right? Or are there obstacles, financial or otherwise, that prevent some people from fully participating in the process?
That's a good point. This ancient text is bringing up some timely questions about equity and access to justice.
It really is, and it challenges us to think about how we can create systems that are truly inclusive, recognizing that everyone deserves the opportunity to make amends and restore balance, regardless of their circumstances.
Okay, we've talked about unintentional sins, the offerings, and even the symbolism in those ancient rituals. But there's another idea from Leviticus I want to explore. Trespassing against holy things.
Ah, yes, that's a fascinating one. It goes to the heart of what the Israelites considered sacred and the boundaries they set around those things.
So break it down for me. What was considered trespassing against holy things in their context?
Well, in ancient Israel, certain objects and spaces were set aside for divine purposes. These could be temples, altars, or even objects used in ceremonies. Misusing or disrespecting these things was seen as a serious offense, even if it was unintentional.
So it wasn't just physically trespassing, but about violating something sacred.
You got it. It's about recognizing those boundaries we shouldn't cross, things we need to treat with respect and reverence. And it poses an interesting question for us. What do we consider sacred in our modern world?
That is a thought-provoking question. It's not as simple as pointing to a temple or a specific object, is it?
Not at all. It makes us think about what we truly value, what principles we see as inviolable. Maybe it's our personal beliefs, our moral code. For others, maybe it's relationships, their community, even nature.
It's almost like we all have these metaphorical holy spaces that we need to be mindful of, even if they aren't physical places.
I love that. And just like in ancient times, trespassing against these spaces, even unknowingly, can have consequences.
So how do we navigate this? How do we avoid accidentally trespassing against the things we hold sacred?
I think it comes down to self-awareness and reflection. It's about really understanding our own values, the things we consider sacred, and being mindful of how our actions affect those things, as well as the values of others.
So it's a lifelong process of learning and growth.
It is, and it's a journey worth taking. Because ultimately, it's about trying to live intentionally, respectfully, and with a deep appreciation for the things that make life meaningful, both for ourselves and those around us.
Well said. So we've talked about unintentional sins, offerings, even those ancient rituals, and the idea of trespassing against holy things.
And throughout it all, we've seen that this ancient text, even though it's from a different time and culture, still has so much to teach us about taking responsibility, making amends, and recognizing what truly matters.
It's been a really enlightening deep dives. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how these ancient practices can offer us insights into what it means to be human. Can you say more about that?
Sure, what strikes me is how Leviticus, even though it's from a specific time and culture, grapples with these universal themes that resonate across time. That struggle with guilt, wanting forgiveness, the importance of community and social responsibility, the need to make amends for harm. These are human experiences that go beyond any particular religion or culture.
That's a powerful thought. There's a timeless wisdom in these texts, something that speaks to the core of being human.
Exactly. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. We're not just exploring history, we're engaging with questions about ourselves, our relationships, and the world we live in.
You've given me a lot to think about, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Leviticus, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. We've been talking about atonement in ancient Israel, but how can we apply these ideas to our lives today? What does it mean to really make amends in the modern world?
That's a great question to think about. It's something each person needs to work through on their own. But here's something to consider. True atonement is more than just saying, I'm sorry. It needs a real change of heart, a willingness to own up to the harm we've caused, and a commitment to taking real steps to make things right. Maybe that means apologizing sincerely, making up for any damage, or changing our behavior so we don't repeat the same mistakes.
So it's not just words, but actions that show we are truly committed to repairing the harm.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility and proving through our actions that we've learned from our mistakes and are committed to becoming better versions of ourselves.
Well said. Dave, that's a great place to stop for today. As we wrap up this deep dive into Leviticus, I keep thinking about how much we've covered. We started with unintentional sin, and now we're talking about justice, responsibility, and what it means to make amends.
It's really amazing how these ancient texts can spark such thought-provoking conversations. We tend to think of them as just rules and rituals.
Right.
But when you really dig in, there are these universal themes that speak to us across time and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of those themes that really got me thinking is that idea of trespassing against holy things. You asked us what we consider sacred in the modern world, and I've been thinking about that a lot.
It's a tough one, right?
It is, because sacred can mean so many things to different people.
Exactly. It's not always about religious beliefs or practices. It's much broader than that. It can be about our relationships, our values, our connection to nature, even our own sense of integrity.
So how do we even begin to navigate that? I mean, how do we avoid those unintentional trespasses, especially when everyone has their own idea of what's sacred?
I think humility is key. We need to recognize that our own idea of what's sacred might not be the same for everyone. Being open to listening to others and really trying to understand their perspective. And being willing to admit when we've crossed a line, even if we didn't mean to.
It sounds like a lot of it comes down to self-awareness and empathy.
You got it. It's about being sensitive to the things that matter deeply to other people, even if they're different from what matters to us. And it's about taking responsibility for our actions, even when we mess up.
Which takes us back to atonement, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about avoiding doing wrong, but about what we do when we inevitably do make mistakes.
Absolutely. Atonement is a journey. It's about making things right, restoring balance, and growing from those experiences. And it doesn't always have to be some big dramatic thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes the most meaningful acts of atonement are the simple things, like a sincere apology, changing our behavior, really making an effort to fix a broken relationship.
It's amazing to me how this deep dive into Leviticus has brought us to a place that feels both ancient and super relevant to our lives right now.
I know what you mean. It's a good reminder that these old texts, even though they come from a specific time and place, can still offer insights into the human experience. They offer a way to understand our struggles, what we hope for, and that constant search for meaning and connection.
I like that. So as we close out this exploration of unintentional sins and atonement, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from all this?
I think it's the understanding that we're all human. We all make mistakes, we all stumble, but it's what we do after those missteps that really matters. Do we brush them aside?
Right.
Or do we see them as chances to grow, to make things right, to become more aware and compassionate people?
I love that. It really captures the spirit of Leviticus. It's not about being perfect, but about embracing that journey of atonement, making things right, and constantly trying to live in better harmony with ourselves, with each other, and with the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, We'll leave you to keep thinking about these ideas. Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep seeking out those aha moments that help us understand ourselves and the world better.
Happy diving!